Text Talks.
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Brian Black at Lancaster University, and this is another episode of Text Talks on Hinduism. And today's lecture is about Gandhi and the Bhagavad Gita. As with our other Text Talk lectures, there is a supplementary slideshow. And so if you're looking at the PowerPoint slides, take a look now at slide number 2. And on this slide, I have two different types of quotations about Gandhi. I'm sure all of you have heard of Mohandas Gandhi. He's famous throughout the world, and throughout so much of the world, he's considered almost as a 20th century saint. As a champion of peace and nonviolence, and as the leader of India's independence movement. None other than Albert Einstein wrote of him, "I believe that Gandhi's views were the most enlightened of all the political men in our time. We should strive to do things in his spirit, not to use violence in fighting for our cause, but by non-participation in anything you believe in is evil. Generations to come will scarce believe that such a one as this in flesh and blood walked upon this earth." I think Albert Einstein's views of Gandhi are widely shared around the world, where Gandhi is almost unquestioningly thought of as a great man. It's interesting, however, though, that this very positive portrayal of Gandhi, although shared in most of the world, is not shared in India. Of course, some people in India have this view of Gandhi, but Gandhi's legacy is far more controversial, is far more mixed in India. And so here also on this slide, I have quotations from two of Gandhi's greatest critics during his lifetime. One, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of the modern country Pakistan. As he put it, "I have nothing to do with this pseudo-religious approach that Gandhi is advocating." And another, B.R. Ambedkar, another leader of India's independence movement. He came from the Mahar caste, which was considered an untouchable caste. He was a champion of caste rights throughout his lifetime. And he saw Gandhi's views of caste as both patronizing and backward. He says, "I hope that Mr. Gandhi will not drive me to the necessity of making a choice between his life," because Gandhi was on he was on a hunger strike. Sorry, I forgot the word. He was on a hunger strike at this time. So a choice between his life and the rights of my people. "For I shall never consent to deliver my people bound hand and foot to the orthodox for generations to come." So let's learn a little bit more about Gandhi, and particularly we'll focus on the ways in which he developed his political ideas from his engagement with the Bhagavad Gita. So if we look at slide number 3, one of the things that we see is that Gandhi really challenged this Western attempt to separate religion and politics. As he puts it famously in the final page of his autobiography, "Those who say religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion is." For him, to be a religious person meant to be acting in the world based on those beliefs that he found to be the most true. So the idea that you could kind of leave your religion at home, leave your spiritual, leave your spiritual side like outside of your public interactions with other people, didn't make any sense. Um, and I have a list on this slide of a number of ideas that are found in Hindu tradition that are important within Gandhi's philosophy. One, religion as a way of life. That religion is not something that that you leave at home, but it's the way that you live every moment of your life. Also, this idea that all religions are true, or in a more traditional Hindu way of putting it, that there are many paths to the same goal. Also, taking vows throughout his lifetime. Gandhi took vows, whether that's a vow to be vegetarian, whether that was a vow to be celibate, etc. Um, his practice of vegetarianism, his setting up an ashram, um, his decision to live most of his adult life abstaining from sexual relations, his going on pilgrimages, his going on fasts, and his drawing on the Bhagavad Gita. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about all of these things here, but I think that when we see this list here, we see all of these aspects of Hinduism, all of these things that are practices throughout Hindu texts and Hindu practices throughout Indian history, all come together in the figure of Gandhi. Okay, now I just have a brief outline of his life. Now we're on slide number 4. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I think it's good to get sort of an overview of his life as a whole. He was born in 1869 in Gujarat, and there's a map here on the left-hand side of the slide, so you can see where Gujarat is in India, as well as where Porbandar is. It was a port town. He married at the age of 13, and that wasn't uncommon at that time. And he ended up being a huge critic of child marriage as he got older. Also, famously, Gandhi lived 3 years in London. Remember, this is, India is a colony of Britain at the time. So, like a lot of aspiring young men growing up in British India, he got an education back in London. After 3 years in London, he returns to India to practice law. That doesn't actually work out for him. And in 1893, he accepts a job in South Africa. Remember, South Africa is also a British colony. So, so it's not, this completely random place for him to be moving. The same law that he learned in London, he can be practicing in South Africa because it's also a British colony. And I think that this period during which Gandhi lives in South Africa should be seen as a hugely formative period in his life. It is during this period where he suffers his own experiences of racial discrimination for the first time. And it's during this time that he becomes more politicized and starts to lead, political demonstrations. And on top of that, starts to develop a philosophy of protest, a philosophy of resistance that he would then bring back to India as he became a leader of the Indian independence movement. He returns to India in 1914. He became the president of the Congress Party in 1924. In 1930, he leads the famous Salt Satyagraha. I'm going to define what the word Satyagraha means in a moment, but basically means demonstration or protest. In 1932, he fasts in protest of separate electorates for untouchables, and it was this protest that that led to his falling out with Ambedkar. In 1942, he launches the Quit India campaign that lasted until India's independence. And then in 1947, India becomes independent. And then in 1947, after India becomes independent in September of that year, he leads a fast until death to stop violence between Hindus and Muslims. And finally, he is assassinated by Hindu extremists in January of 1948. So he only lived to see, about 6 months of independent India. Okay, I just want to visit a few of these of these occasions in his life. One, the Salt Satyagraha of 1930. Now, the Salt Satyagraha is one of Gandhi's most famous acts, and this was in protest of the British government's decision to tax salt. And so, like other demonstrations, Gandhi decides to make a big public event out of his opposition to this salt tax. Now, I think a lot of people, if they were, to organize a protest against salt, they might, organize a protest with a lot of people down by the ocean, and they would collect their own salt and try to bring attention to it. But Gandhi, being Gandhi, he makes it a much bigger deal than that. Rather than decide to meet on the coast to collect salt from the ocean, he leads a 24-day march, 241 miles away from the coastal village of Dundee, where he would ultimately collect the salt. So in other words, he makes it into a pilgrimage. And this is something that Gandhi does throughout his political life, is he draws on these religious practices, these religious symbols, to help galvanize support and bring greater attention to what he's doing. He has more than 100,000 people march with him along the way. When he reaches the coastal village, he picks up a palm full of sea salt in open defiance of the government's ban. And this act inspired thousands of people then to make salt illegally. 60,000 people end up getting arrested, including Gandhi. And then this ends up leading to negotiations back in London. Now, interestingly, during the march, first of all, the day of the march the day of the beginning of the march coincides with the publication of Gandhi's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, and he carries the Bhagavad Gita with him during the march. So he both relies on the Bhagavad Gita as a source of his teachings, of a source of his sort of political ideology, but it's also symbolic. Now, I have a slide very briefly that I'll talk about, slide number 6. I think that it's important to know, especially those of us learning about Gandhi in Britain, and especially something I like telling my students at Lancaster University, that Gandhi visited Lancashire. He visited Lancashire during a time when not only was he conducting the salt protest, but he was more widely protesting the British policy towards Indian cotton. In those days, as India was a colony of Britain, economically, Britain would take raw material of cotton from India, bring it back to Britain, and basically produce, clothing and other textiles from cotton back in Britain, and then sell it in India. One of the ways in which Gandhi challenged Britain's economic hold on India was to decide not to buy cotton made in Britain. Um, and this was a way to really hurt, the British colonial policy. But it also put a lot of people back in Britain back to work. Gandhi, though, saw himself as protesting against imperial policies, not the average working person back in Britain. So he understood that his independence movement in India was actually hurting people, working class people back in Britain, and a lot of working class people in Britain didn't like Gandhi because of these protests. And so he went and visited cotton mills in the northwest of England, and interestingly won over a lot of support for his protests against English-made cotton back in India. Okay, now another hugely important moment in Gandhi's life was the so-called miracle in Calcutta. This was sort of his last major event before he died. In the immediate aftermath of Indian independence, there was widespread communal violence raging, especially in Bengal and the Punjab, as India became an independent country. Violence between Hindus and Muslims. And so as this violence was really raging in Bengal, Gandhi went to Calcutta and decided to fast unto death to stop the violence. As Bhikkhu Parekh puts it, many who had been busy killing arrived at his bedside, wept at his tormented body, surrendered their weapons, and gave him a written undertaking that they would allow no more violence to occur. So almost miraculously, he put an end to that violence. And that was really, one of his final acts and one of his most beneficial and well-known ones. Now I just want to say a few things, though, that now that we know a little bit more about Gandhi, some of the more famous things that he did, I just want to make a point that so much of Gandhi's approach to life came from his engagement not only with the Hindu tradition, but one particular text, and that is the Bhagavad Gita. As he famously said, "When doubts haunt me, when disappointments stare me in the face, and I see not one ray of hope on the horizons, I turn to the Bhagavad Gita and find a verse to comfort me." And in a sense, I think we can see that so many of the main ideas that come out in the Bhagavad Gita are almost directly translatable into some of the ideas that he talks about in his own political philosophy. So first of all, the idea of dharma, the duty to act, the responsibility for others. This is something that Gandhi takes very seriously. Now, the yoga of knowledge, we already had a lecture on the Bhagavad Gita. That's not something that Gandhi talks as much about. But karma yoga, the idea that your pursuit of higher truth shouldn't take you away from the world, but should basically foster and guide your engagement with the world, is something that Gandhi takes very seriously. Another very important idea in the Bhagavad Gita, bhakti yoga, devotion to God. Gandhi was a very religious man, and he saw his engagement with the world as not only his responsibility towards others, but his responsibility towards God. One of the interesting things, however, though, is that even though the Bhagavad Gita is about a war, it's about Krishna persuading Arjuna to fight in a war, Gandhi's interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita very much sees war as an allegory, and instead he emphasizes nonviolence or ahimsa. Okay, so I want to talk about two of Gandhi's most famous ideas. One is Swaraj. Swaraj um, technically means self rule. And one meaning is a sovereign kingdom free from external control. So, for example, one meaning of Swaraj in terms of the context of Indian independence is that Indians should rule themselves, not be ruled over by the British. However, for Gandhi, there's a deeper meaning to Swaraj. There's a more important meaning to Swaraj. And this is the rule that this is self rule of one having control over their passions and emotions. As he put it, real Swaraj is self rule, self control. And in this way, Swaraj is a kind of yoga, it's a kind of discipline. It's a way of having control over oneself, um, so that therefore one is not controlled by others. One of the things we see here in the pictures on this slide is on the left. We see that here's Gandhi as a young man when he's going off to London, and in this time in his life, he very much sees himself as a young English gentleman who's off to study law and to be a sort of gentleman in the English Empire. One of the things that Gandhi resists, though, throughout his lifetime is not only British influence, political and economic, over his country, but he sees that through colonialism, he himself has started adopting British values, British ways of looking at the world, British tastes, British habits. And so, in a sense, we might see Gandhi's lifetime is a process of not only trying to decolonize India, but to decolonize himself. And so here he is in the picture on the right in his visit to London as an adult, where he has basically adopted, indigenous ways of dressing, Indian ways of Indian tastes, habits, sensibilities, etc. Okay, so whereas Swaraj is about self-control, Satyagraha basically means truth force or insistence on the truth, struggle for truth. And so Satyagraha was Gandhi's word for a political protest or a political demonstration. And so one of the ways in which Swaraj and Satyagraha go hand in hand together is that Swaraj is necessary to participate in a Satyagraha. Why? Because to demonstrate politically, to protest publicly, invited not only verbal abuse from his opponents, but sometimes during protests, Gandhi and his followers would be arrested, they would be beaten up. And as Gandhi was completely committed to this idea of nonviolence, he asked himself and his followers to have complete control over themselves so that no matter how much they would be verbally or physically abused, they would never fight back. And one of the things that we can see is that Gandhi never did, and most of his followers did not either. And this, by staying absolutely true to this commitment of nonviolent, basically strengthened the force of their protest. But here we can see how both Satyagraha and Swaraj really go hand in hand. Okay, so I think that when we see, I just want to now relate these ideas back to the Bhagavad Gita again. As I said, we see elements of yoga in Swaraj. So although it's not a direct, it doesn't have a direct relationship, I would argue that that Swaraj really has close connections to karma yoga, in the sense that it's a practice of self-discipline. But then when you combine it with satyagraha, a practice of self-discipline that one practices with their engagement in the world, not as a way of trying to renounce the world. Okay, so I just have one final slide with a number of discussion questions that I would encourage you to think about as you do your own reading and your own reflections upon Gandhi. And I'll read out these questions just so we can start thinking about them, but I'll let you reflect with yourselves, with your classmates and your teachers to take this further. Why do you think that Gandhi thought that religion and politics are inseparable? What examples from Gandhi's thought and actions demonstrate how religion and politics are interlinked? Do you agree with Gandhi that religion and politics cannot be separated? Would Gandhi have been as successful if he had tried to separate his religious beliefs from his politics? Do you think religion should play more of a part in politics in Britain? In what ways does religion already play a role in British politics? Also, thinking about what's going on right now in the world, when we think about the Black Lives Matter protests and demonstrations going on not only throughout North America, but in Britain as well. And as these protests in Britain has taken on the additional form of reevaluating Britain's colonial past, we might wonder to what degree Gandhi's ideas are still relevant today. To what extent is his vision of mass protest and demonstration, as well as as some of the people that he influenced, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in what ways has their influence been a factor in the protests going on now? In what ways has their legacy been abandoned as some of these protests turn violent? Basically, are there ways in which his protests are, his approach to protests, especially when we think of Swaraj and Satyagraha, are they as relevant today? In what ways might they be reformulated as we think of some of the political struggles that we face today that are perhaps a little bit different from the ones that he faced in his lifetime? Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to our next text talks.